Have you ever noticed how much of your life is spent trying to explain yourself? Why you feel a certain way, why you said no, why you didn't answer right away, why you're not smiling when everyone else is. At first it seems like politeness, like empathy. But what if I told you this endless need to justify yourself is not kindness at all? It's a symptom of something much deeper. What if every "sorry, I was just tired" or "don't take it the wrong way" is actually a cry for permission to exist? Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds of analytical psychology, saw this pattern with brutal clarity. He believed that people who compulsively explain themselves are not being considerate. They are disconnected from themselves. They are trapped in a prison where the jailer is invisible, but powerful. The belief that their truth has no value unless someone else approves it. Can you see yourself in this? Think about how many times you've reshaped your feelings into something acceptable. You said you were fine when you weren't. You disguised sadness as fatigue. You rationalized anger as stress. Every explanation seems small, innocent, but together they reveal something terrifying. You no longer live for yourself, but for the audience around you. You have become a character in a play you never chose to perform. And here's the hard truth. Behind every compulsive explanation is fear. Fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of abandonment. Explaining yourself becomes a way to control how others perceive you. You believe that if they understand your reasons, maybe they won't leave, won't criticize, won't condemn. But in this desperate attempt to protect yourself, you sacrifice the very thing that matters most, your inner freedom. Before we go deeper, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. What you're about to discover may completely change the way you see yourself and your relationships. Now let me ask you, what would happen if you stopped explaining yourself? What if you embraced the silence instead of filling it with justifications? What kind of strength would emerge if you trusted that your feelings don't need to be translated to be valid? That is exactly what Jung invites us to confront. And once you understand this, nothing in your life will ever look the same again. To understand why so many adults compulsively explain themselves, we need to go back to where it all began. Childhood. Imagine a child expressing sadness only to hear, "Stop being dramatic," or confessing fear and receiving laughter in return, or showing anger and being told, "Don't be so difficult." These small, repeated responses carve deep marks in the psyche. The child quickly learns an invisible rule. What I feel is not valid unless others confirm it. This is the seed of the wound Jung identified. When the most intimate experiences, emotions, are constantly invalidated, the child begins to doubt themselves. They internalize the idea that their inner world cannot be trusted. Over time, the ego develops a survival mechanism. If I explain myself clearly, maybe they won't reject me. Maybe they won't punish me. Maybe they'll finally accept me. What begins as a defense in a hostile environment transforms into a lifelong pattern. And here's the tragedy. What once protected the child now enslaves the adult. You keep explaining yourself at work, in relationships, even in moments of intimacy. Not because you owe explanations, but because deep down, the child inside you still fears being abandoned for simply being who you are. Can you see how heavy this cycle becomes? It is like living in a courtroom that never adjourns, always waiting for the verdict of others to confirm your right to exist. The compulsion to explain, then, is not about courtesy. It is about survival. It is the lingering echo of a young self who never received unconditional permission to feel. And this is why Jung saw it as a central obstacle to individuation. As long as you are explaining yourself, you are not free. You are chained to the gaze of others, hoping that your truth will finally be validated. But here's the uncomfortable question. How long will you keep living this way? Little by little, the habit of explaining yourself becomes something far more dangerous than a social courtesy. It turns into self-abandonment. Each time you justify a decision, disguise a feeling, or soften your truth to avoid conflict, you are essentially saying to yourself, "My experience only matters if others approve of it." Can you see how subtle this betrayal is? It doesn't happen in big, dramatic gestures, but in everyday moments so small that they often go unnoticed. Think of when you laughed at something you didn't find funny just to fit in, or when you said yes while every part of you wanted to scream no, afraid of being called selfish. Or when you explained your sadness as just being tired, because you didn't want to be a burden. Each of these little concessions seems harmless, but together, they create an invisible erosion of your soul. Slowly, you start living more for others than for yourself. Jung described this process as one of the most destructive forms of fragmentation. The ego, instead of serving as the conscious bridge to the self, becomes a servant of external approval. You stop trusting your intuition, start doubting your emotions, and second-guess your every choice. Over time, insecurity replaces confidence, and silence fills the space where authenticity once lived. The result? A chronic sense of emptiness, because the most vital part of you has been exiled. The worst part is that society often rewards this betrayal. People who adapt, who always explain themselves, who avoid conflict, are called polite, easygoing, or agreeable. But what the world applauds is often the very thing that is destroying you from within. Behind the applause, there is exhaustion. Behind the good behavior, there is a self slowly being suffocated. And this is why Jung warned. Neurosis often arises not from external chaos, but from the quiet violence of a life lived in contradiction to one's own truth. So I'll ask you, how many times have you betrayed yourself this week? How often have you silenced your real feelings to be accepted? The more honest your answer, the clearer you will see the depth of this wound. Because every compulsive explanation is not just a sentence, it is a small abandonment. And until you recognize this, you'll keep living a life that belongs more to others than to yourself. When you betray yourself often enough, the consequences don't just stay hidden inside. They spill into every area of your life. Jung warned that the psyche never tolerates fragmentation for long. When the ego disconnects from the self, the true center of wholeness, the soul begins to scream, but it doesn't scream with words. It screams with symptoms. Have you ever felt an emptiness that no achievement seems to fill? A constant anxiety that has no clear reason? A gnawing doubt about every decision you make, no matter how small? These are not random feelings. They are the psyche's way of signaling that something is terribly wrong. Every compulsive explanation, every moment of self-betrayal, every time you chose approval over authenticity, accumulates until the inner structure begins to crack. That's why neuroses, as Jung explained, are not just medical conditions, they are messages. Anxiety is not always about the future, but about the present self you keep abandoning. Depression is not always about sadness, but about the life force that has been exiled, because you live more for others than for yourself. Even the difficulty of making choices, that paralysis that leaves you stuck, is often the echo of a truth you no longer trust. And here's the paradox. The very behavior that society praises, the one who adapts, who explains, who avoids conflict, often hides a person on the brink of collapse. On the outside, harmony. On the inside, exhaustion. The soul is tired of bending, tired of asking permission, tired of dressing itself in justifications to avoid judgment. What looks like kindness can in fact be slow self-destruction. This is why Jung insisted that individuation, the process of becoming whole, is not a luxury. It's survival. Without reconnecting with your inner authority, you risk living a life that is outwardly correct but inwardly hollow. You may succeed socially, but at the cost of being a stranger to yourself. And that, Jung believed, is one of the deepest forms of suffering. Living a life in which your essence never gets to breathe. If this resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because the more we normalize silence instead of compulsive explanation, the more we reclaim our true strength. Up to this point, we've seen how the compulsion to explain yourself is born from invalidation, grows into self-betrayal, and explodes in symptoms of emptiness and anxiety. But Jung did not stop at diagnosis. He offered a path, and that path begins with one of the most powerful concepts in his psychology: internal authority. Internal authority is not arrogance nor indifference to others. It is the capacity to affirm your own inner experience without begging for validation. It is the moment when you stop asking, "Will they understand me?" and begin to state, "It doesn't matter if they do. This is my truth." This shift sounds simple, but in practice it is revolutionary, because it relocates the center of gravity of your psyche from the fragile hands of external approval back into the unshakable core of yourself. But why is this so difficult? Because the first time you stop explaining yourself, fear rushes in. Fear of being rejected, fear of being judged, fear of losing people. Jung called this stage the desert of solitude. It is the psychological crossing where, for the first time, you allow yourself to hold a no without guilt. You end a conversation without feeling the need to give reasons. You change your mind without offering apologies. And though everything in you trembles, you discover that the world does not collapse. In fact, something inside you begins to rise. This is the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming whole. When silence stops being emptiness and becomes affirmation, when you no longer waste energy building arguments to prove you are allowed to exist, when you realize that existence itself is the only permission you need. This is not about closing yourself off to dialogue. It's about no longer negotiating your essence to be accepted. The challenge is clear. Can you endure the discomfort of not being understood and still remain faithful to yourself? Most people cannot. That's why they stay trapped in the theater of explanations. But those who dare cross this desert discover a kind of freedom that cannot be faked. The freedom of coherence. The freedom of standing rooted in one's truth even when the world demands an explanation you refuse to give. Internal authority is not something abstract that exists only in theory. It reveals itself in daily life, in gestures so small that most people would overlook them. Shows itself when you say no without rushing to add excuses. When you end a conversation because you're tired without apologizing for it. When you choose silence instead of trying to soften the discomfort of being misunderstood. Each of these moments may seem ordinary, but in truth they are revolutionary acts. Think about it. How many times have you agreed to something only to avoid the uncomfortable silence that follows a no? How many times have you added, "I'm sorry, I can't," because just to sound less selfish? That little phrase, "because," is often nothing more than a disguised plea. Please don't be upset with me. Jung teaches us that dropping the "because" is a step toward wholeness. To say simply, "no," and let silence carry the weight of your truth. This silence is not empty, it is full. It is charged with presence, with a kind of authority that others immediately feel. The people around you sense the difference between someone who is begging to be accepted and someone who already accepts themselves. That is why silence can be more powerful than 1,000 explanations. It disarms manipulators. It protects boundaries. It commands respect without a single raised voice. But here's the challenge. The first times you practice this, anxiety will try to take over. You'll feel the urge to add that extra justification, to explain yourself just one more time. That's when the old conditioning fights back, and it will feel almost unbearable. Yet, it is in precisely these moments that transformation occurs. Each time you resist the impulse to explain, you strengthen your internal authority. Each time you stay silent, you reclaim a piece of yourself. With practice, this authority stops being an effort and becomes a natural stance. You no longer need to rehearse explanations in your mind. You no longer fear disappointing others by standing in your truth. You realize that the only approval you ever needed was your own. And when that happens, life shifts in ways that cannot be undone. When you begin to embody internal authority, something profound happens. Your relationships start to change. At first, this shift may seem unsettling, even threatening. People who were accustomed to your constant justifications suddenly encounter silence. They ask why, and for the first time, you don't answer. They expect excuses, and instead they find firmness. They try to negotiate your boundaries, and you simply repeat, "This doesn't work for me." Without drama, without defense, without guilt. This silence is like a mirror. It exposes the true dynamics of the relationship. Those who were by your side out of genuine affinity will adjust, will respect the new posture, and may even admire your strength. But those who benefited from your insecurity will react with resistance. Manipulators, controllers, and emotional blackmailers lose their power the moment you stop explaining yourself. Why? Because their influence relied on your fear of being misunderstood. Once that fear collapses, their control disintegrates. Jung often said that individuation requires rupture, and this is exactly what happens here. Some people will distance themselves. They'll call you cold, selfish, or difficult. But don't be deceived. This isn't a sign of failure, it's a sign of liberation. Your silence becomes a filter, separating the connections built on control from those rooted in respect. What remains are relationships based not on fear or dependence, but on authenticity and mutual recognition. This process can feel painful. After all, the child within you still longs for approval, still fears abandonment. But every time you choose not to explain yourself, you strengthen a new inner voice, the one that says, "I accept myself." And as this voice grows louder, the bonds that survive are the ones that nourish your essence instead of suffocating it. The paradox is that the fewer explanations you give, the more genuine respect you receive. Because people sense the difference. You are no longer begging for a place in their lives. You already know you belong to your own. And from this new position, every relationship either transforms or fades away. Silence, when born from insecurity, feels like absence. It tastes like fear, like avoidance, like submission. But silence rooted in internal authority is something entirely different. It is not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. It is the silence of someone who doesn't need to prove anything. And this difference changes everything. Jung understood this with striking clarity. For him, silence was not emptiness but fullness. It was not withdrawal but presence. When you stop justifying yourself, your silence begins to radiate a kind of weight that words could never carry. People feel it. Rooms shift. Conversations take on new dynamics. The one who once filled every pause with explanations now inhabits the pause itself, with dignity, with strength, with coherence. This silence is unsettling for those who fed on your insecurity. They expect you to dance, to justify, to soften boundaries. And when you don't, they face a wall they cannot penetrate. It is not an aggressive wall, but a steady one. An immovable stance that communicates without words. I exist. I don't owe you a trial for it. This is why silence has the power to end manipulative games without a single confrontation. It removes the fuel that kept them alive, your need to be understood. But silence also has a magnetic effect. The more you embody it, the more respect you naturally evoke. People lean in, curious, attentive, not because you are forcing them, but because your presence speaks louder than any explanation. True silence commands, not through intimidation, but through authenticity. It is the vibration of someone who finally belongs to themselves. And here's the hidden gift. This silence not only transforms the way others see you, it transforms the way you see yourself. In the absence of explanations, you start to hear your own voice more clearly. In the space once occupied by justifications, your intuition finally has room to breathe. Silence outside creates listening inside, and that is where the deepest transformation begins. When silence takes root, something extraordinary begins to happen. You start to hear yourself again. The constant noise of justifications fades, and what was once muffled finally gains clarity. Your own inner voice. This is the moment Jung described as the emergence of psychological integrity. Integrity is not about perfection, nor about being unshakable. It is about coherence. It is about no longer fragmenting yourself to fit the molds of others, no longer hiding parts of your truth to avoid discomfort. An integrated person does not beg to be understood. They do not spend energy convincing others of their worth. They communicate, yes, but their words are not pleas for acceptance. They are simple expressions of truth. And because of that, they carry a weight that explanations never could. The difference is subtle, but you can feel it. Instead of speaking to be approved, you speak to be authentic. Integrity also means trusting your own perceptions even when you cannot rationally explain them. Have you ever felt a situation was wrong without being able to point out why? The old you would try to justify it with evidence, arguments, logical reasons. The integrated you simply says, "This doesn't resonate with me." And that alone is enough. Because when you stop negotiating your essence, the need for justification disappears. The paradox is that this coherence, far from isolating you, makes you magnetic. People are drawn to those who are whole, who radiate consistency between what they feel, think, and do. Even if they don't agree with you, they respect you. Because integrity has density. It has weight, it has presence. You no longer need to claim a space in the world. Your coherence makes the world naturally give you that space. But make no mistake, integrity is not about never doubting or never stumbling. It is about not abandoning yourself when doubt comes. It is about standing by your truth, even when it is inconvenient, even when it disappoints others, even when it makes you walk alone for a while. And that is precisely why Jung saw integrity as one of the most mature expressions of individuation. The moment when you stop negotiating your existence and start embodying it fully. When a person stops explaining themselves, everything changes, not just within, but in the very fabric of their reality. It's as if the vibration they emit shifts frequency. Before, every word carried the hidden message, "Please accept me." Now, without justifications, the presence itself declares, "I know who I am." And the world cannot ignore that. Jung knew that the psyche is not guided only by logic, but by energy. The insecure one radiates doubt. The one who compulsively explains radiates submission. But the integrated individual, the one who no longer negotiates their essence, radiates authority. This authority is not domination. It is coherence. It is the strength of someone who belongs to themselves, and because of that, cannot be possessed by anyone else. Relationships reorganize. Manipulative dynamics collapse. Environments that once drained you no longer hold power over you. And new doors open, because the world respects those who respect themselves. The fewer explanations you give, the clearer your boundaries become. And the clearer your boundaries, the freer your life becomes. Silence, far from being emptiness, becomes the most eloquent expression of your soul. But this journey demands courage, because every time you choose silence over justification, the old fear whispers, what if they reject you? What if they leave? And here lies the true turning point. You realize that losing people is not the real danger. The real danger is losing yourself. If this message resonated with you, don't leave it here. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and leave in the comments which explanation you are ready to stop giving. This may be your first act of reclaiming your inner authority. And remember, sometimes, the greatest proof of strength is not what you say, but what you refuse to explain. The less you justify your existence, the more undeniable it becomes.